Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this policy exchange debate on high-speed rail. This strikes me as a kind of a big debate in lots of different ways, not just because it's a debate about a big and expensive project, but because it raises lots of issues which are themselves very big questions. How do we make a decision about whether high-speed rail is the right thing to do? Well, do we need to build a railway line anyway? What do we expect demand to be? What is the counterfactual, as it were? What is it that we could be spending our money on instead? How do we judge whether this is a good project? What do we comparing it with? How do you calculate the economic benefits of a project like this? I mean, the traditional approach at the Department of Transport was to look at how much time people save, try and put a value on that time. But the advocates of high-speed rail, particularly lauded donors, often make much bigger arguments than those, arguments about reshaping the whole economic geography of the country. How on earth do you put a number on something like that? And how do we calculate environmental benefits? What assumptions do we make? And how do we value them? All very, very difficult questions. Fortunately, this evening we have an extremely distinguished panel of people to help us unpick all those questions. Leading the batting for the yes side, we have Julian Glover, who's well known to you all as a commentator from The Guardian. Then opposed to him first, we will have Chris Stokes. Chris is a rail industry consultant for a long time. He was previously deputy director at Network Southeast. Then we have back for the yes side, we have Jim Steer, who is the director of Green Gauge 21, a not-for-profit campaigning group making the case for high-speed rail in Britain. He was formerly the managing director of the Strategic Rail Authority. And then lastly, but not leastly, we have Dr. Tim Loynick, who is reader in economic history at the LSE, and also the author of Policy Exchange's pamphlets, What to Do About Trains in Britain. So, we have an extremely distinguished panel. You all have between 5 and 10 minutes. We will make you run on time, I promise. There will be no excuses for late running of any of your speeches. So, without any further ado, it's my pleasure to hand over to you, Julian. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much and good evening. This is a really important debate. The government has chosen high-speed rail as one of the definitive things it wants to do in power to show that it isn't just about cuts, it's about building a new kind of economy and a new kind of country. And it's doing so partly because all three parties at the last election backed high-speed rail, and I think all three still do, though Labour seems to be supporting both sides, and Andrew Davis is certainly slightly worried about the party going wobbly. And maybe it's just a characteristic British thing that as soon as we all agree we want something, everybody starts picking apart the plans and panicking about it. Now, of course, there's a risk that when all politicians want something, that's a sign it's a bad thing, it's a gizmo, it's a gimmick, it's the new Concorde. I don't think that's the case with high-speed rail. They did so because politicians know that Britain's more than a giant economy in the southeast of England with a very impoverished north attached to it. And they did so because Britain's main north-south transport routes are either full or about to be, because new capacity and faster journeys are needed, and because high-speed rail around the world has been chosen as a more environmentally acceptable and a useful way of doing that than building another M1 or incremental line expansion, which I'm sure we'll hear about from the other side this evening, just make the existing railways better. Well, we tried that with the West Coast Main Line, which is much of the route that the high-speed line will try and serve as well, and we spent about £13 billion upgrading that, and trains hardly got any faster. It didn't really add capacity. There isn't room for the proper freight services on that line where they want to go. Local services on that line are not very good, and it wasn't £13 billion very well spent. Certainly, I think the costs of high-speed rail are huge. I accept the figures we all bandy around now will change. All projects do overrun, but 24 billion to 30 billion for a whole high-speed line is a lot less than 13 billion for some new signals. Now, there are new people calling for this upgrade, but it really isn't possible to use a 200-year-old line and spend more money on it and make it bigger and make it do all the things we want. So we have to make some choices if we are going to have high-speed rail. You could do nothing, of course. You could just keep using high fares to drive people off peak trains, have scenes at Euston Station as we already have on Friday nights with people not being able to get home. You could do that quite happily forever. It's what would happen if critics of high-speed 2 get their way. Because I don't think there's any sign that the money that could be found for a new high-speed line, and it could be found after the current spending round, would be found for the railway elsewhere. It isn't the case that this is a choice between lots and lots of little incremental upgrades all over Britain or a new line. We do need upgrades as well. We need to do things like electrify the lines to the west of England, which the government is slowly doing. But I think we need to build a high-speed line too. And I think if we did ever build it, we'd use it, and we'd find it attractive, and we'd be pleased it was there. But there are objections. And I think in the end, those come down to two areas, and they're strong objections, and I think people who support the high-speed line shouldn't be starry-eyed about it. And one is cost, and that question, is it worth it, just for faster trains to Birmingham? And people will say it's only a few minutes, and you can get to Birmingham pretty well at the moment anyway. We've even got competing train lines going to Birmingham already, and some of those might continue. But it isn't just about Birmingham to London, and if this was just about Birmingham to London, I'd agree that really the case for it was quite weak. It's about an entirely new and reliable and high-capacity transport link between London, yes, but also Manchester, Birmingham, Derby, Nottingham, Sheffield, Leeds, and in the end points to the north as well. Many of those journeys are quite short, but they're ones where at the moment transport links are terrible. If you try and go from Birmingham to Manchester, Birmingham to Derby, or let alone across from Birmingham to Yorkshire, you cannot do it easily by road or rail. This isn't about just replacing existing good things with even better trains, it's about something that doesn't exist at all. And you'll hear from critics of high-speed rail, the distances aren't short. In other countries, they can zoom across France or Spain. Well, lots of Japanese high-speed lines, the circuit to Tokyo, are quite short. They're not much different to the British distances. The cities are big as well, and they work. So I don't think the idea that we aren't trying to build 500 miles of line at the start is an objection. The fact that journeys are going to be very quick is a benefit, not a harm. Indeed, I'd say that the case for starting the high-speed line is so strong that I think the case for building some of the lines in the middle of Britain is as strong as starting in the south. Birmingham to Yorkshire, it could begin immediately. It would not have the same planning debates that we're going to have in the Chilterns, and there is no good transport on that axis. But even before the whole network's finished, people will benefit from using the bits that are built, and the first bit will be the bit to Birmingham. Cities will benefit from trains already on existing lines, moving on to high-speed lines to London. And I know we'll hear too tonight about places that the trains won't stop, because one of the things that everybody finds if they plan infrastructure in Britain is that everybody wants a motorway exit near their house, and they want a high-speed rail station. And the point of high-speed trains is they don't stop everywhere, but they can have lots of different routes, and they can come off and they can slow down in other places. So Stoke-on-Trent, where Tristram Hunt, my good friend, is very worried about losing his fast train to London to get him back home. Well, I think that will continue. If there's a demand for trains from Stoke-on-Trent, they will still be there. They can join the high-speed line further south. This is not a choice between 4 stations with good trains and all the others with no trains. It's about speeding everything up. Now, the other objection, which is it is in the news at the moment, is environmental. And that comes down to two things, really. One is the sort of noise and impact, but the other is just people losing their homes, cutting through countryside. And we should take that seriously. We should take it seriously with all infrastructure planning, all development. We do in Britain. CPRE, which is not opposed to high-speed lines, but is concerned about the impact of it, particularly the Chilterns, makes that point. But they don't start off by saying we should never build high-speed railways. Now, I've been to Buckinghamshire, I've walked some of the routes through the Chilterns, I've met some people whose houses are going to have high-speed trains through the back garden. And I can see quite easily why they're worried. And it's certainly pushing things to say that all the train's going to be in the tunnel, or all of it's going to run down a road corridor, and that gives the impression that nobody will be affected. There will be green land taken, and it will go through things that people can see, and it will make a bit of noise. But we should remember that high speed isn't some alien thing to Britain, some terrible intrusion. First of all, we have a lot of railways, including in the Chilterns, where people commute to and from quite happily on existing trains that would no doubt rise up if they were told they were going to be taken away. But secondly, of course, we've got high-speed lines running through Kent, and many of the same concerns were raised before that was built. Once it was built, I think people found it wasn't quite as bad as they'd feared. And I live in East London, a high-speed line goes through a tunnel not far underneath my house. People in London who are worried about trains being tunnelled under their property, Primrose Hill, the Miliband territory is apparently deeply concerned. It isn't the end of the world. These things can be built, and they work. Now, there will be houses exposed to noise. There will be some demolished, maybe 10, maybe will have an impact on most people's lives. But I don't think that the concerns of a small number of people about a railway can shape national planning any more than the concerns of a number of people about a motorway or other development, which we have constantly put through Britain. We built the M40 through the Chilterns without any similar fuss. And anyway, the alternative to high speed 2, I think, would not be nothing, would not just be lots of happy sheep grazing in fields. It would be more roads, widening existing railways that, unlike high speed 2, run right through the middle of lots of towns and villages. It would be slower journeys, more congestion, fewer seats, and higher fares. So it's right that people of Chilterns make their view felt. But I think that people before high speed 1 did the same and saw that that did work. environmental mitigation has got better since then, and I think that this problem can be overcome. Now, I'm not coming here as some evangelist saying High Speed 2 is easy, or even that the figures will convince you it has to be built. In the end, it is a bit of a gamble. Everything is a gamble of this scale. It's probably less of a gamble than spending £12 billion or more buying some joint strike fighter aircraft to put on board an aircraft carrier that we don't have at the moment, or even an aircraft carrier that doesn't have any planes. It's also, of course, a gamble about whether we want our future to be railways or roads. And I know Tim might argue that the future of railways is really commuter travel, urban transit, and that's where the money should go, not subsidising people travelling between cities. And I think Britain does need good transport within it. I think high speed's the way to do it. I think it's wonderful that all the parties in Britain are supporting it, and I think it would be a dreadful shame when we got so close to actually starting to build it if we ran away and decided not to go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julian. And Chris, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. I've spent my career in the rail industry. Emotionally, I would naturally tend to support High Speed 2. About this time last year, I started to look at the business case, and the more I dug into it, the worse it proved to be. I should also stress I'm not a NIMBY. I don't live on the route. I know Andrew McNaughton, the Chief Engineer of High Speed 2, and I actually think he's done a very good job in designing it. I think the route is good, the business case is not. A number of arguments put forward to support the scheme, which Julian's already referred to some of them. The environmental benefits. It's not green. Like for like, faster trains consume more energy, and additional trains to carry extra passengers consume even more energy. The transfer from car is minimal. According to DfT's own figures, only 7% of HS2's passengers are forecast to come from road, and this gives 2% congestion relief on the M1. Will anybody notice? Transfer from air is no better at 6%. Manchester is the only city directly served by High Speed 2 with flights to London, and rail already has 85% of the combined rail-air market already. And domestic travel to all London's airports has declined by 20% since 2004. Interestingly, British Midland have just pulled out of Glasgow to Heathrow, but they are using the slots at Heathrow for new longer distance routes, so no carbon saving there. And a few months ago, I think supporters of High Speed 2 might have told us that nuclear power will decarbonise electricity supply for the rail network, but perhaps we won't hear that argument today. HS2 themselves only claim the project is carbon neutral. But what about future demand? I would certainly expect growth, but not the 200% plus growth forecast by government. Take London, Manchester. There's been rapid growth since the dramatic service improvements in 2008. Julian tried to portray these as minimal, but before the upgrade, there was one train an hour taking 2 hours 40 minutes. Today there is one train every 20 minutes taking 2 hours 8 minutes. So there's been a step change in frequency and a step improvement in journey time. But this is a step change over 3 to 4 years, not a straight line ever upwards. Eurostar, operating on our existing high-speed line, has captured the lion's share of London to Paris, but the market is near saturation, and its passenger numbers in 2009 are 37% of those forecast for the route that the route would achieve in 2006, when the project for the high-speed one was originally put forward. For rail projects more generally, research on this by Danish academics in 2006 states, for 9 out of 10 rail projects, passenger forecasts are overestimated. Average overestimation is 106%. On HS1, DfT told the Department of Transport told the Public Accounts Committee that they'd learned the lesson. Next time it considered undertaking a major transport project, it would factor more severe downsides into its business case analysis. They haven't. Let's hope Parliament holds the executive to account before the money is spent this time. The need for capacity. Average intercity load factors on the West Coast Main Line are only about 50%. Apparently on the railways this is a crisis. Interestingly, an airline with a load factor of less than 80% would have a different sort of crisis. It would be bankrupt. I agree there's likely to be growth, albeit much less than government forecasts, but there are sensible value for money, incremental actions to meet future growth. For a start, get rid of artificial peaks. Julian talked about overcrowding out of Euston on Friday nights. The overcrowding is on the first train after 1900, which is the first train on which savers are allowed. Savers are regulated, so they are, for passengers, dramatically better value for money. This is an artificial peak. People wanting to go away for the weekend would not peak at 7 o'clock in the evening. They do so because of pricing policy. That can be sorted. We should lengthen all the Pendolino trains from 9 to 11 cars. Currently only 31 out of 52 are being lengthened. Apparently the Department of Transport did not consider it was value for money to lengthen them all, but what the hell, we'll spend £30 billion to build a new railway. The lengthening gives 51% more standard class seats per set per train, which is a pretty useful increase. We can actually physically lengthen them to 12 cars, except to Liverpool, because Liverpool Lime Street is stuck between the buffer stops and a tunnel. You can't run 12-car trains, but everywhere else you could run 12-car trains. Reduce the first class from 4 to 3 cars. I don't know whether many of you have been on a West Coast train recently in first class, but it's wide open spaces. There are very few people. Smarter IT. By 2026, surely we will have fully reservable trains with a flexibility so that you can walk through Euston Station, use your mobile device of choice in 2026, and if there is a seat available on the next train out, you can book it there and then. This will enable load factors to be increased without overcrowding. And if needed in the longer term, targeted investment at pinch points. Most of the route can take more trains. There are a few locations where some money might be invested. So it's not digging up the whole route, it's adding capacity at a few locations where it's needed. By the way, there's a major problem now. Fast commuter trains to Milton Keynes and Northampton are already seriously overcrowded. If you want to be certain of getting a seat, you need to turn up 15 minutes before departure. They're going to get worse because of the population growth in those areas. HS2 will relieve this, but not until 2026. DfT's own documentation on the alternatives shows that a flyover south of Milton Keynes would enable the service to be doubled. That could be achieved in about 5 years at a cost, DfT's figures, of 243 million, a third of the 750 million earmarked for developing HS2 in the current spending round. Regeneration. Ministers are claiming HS2 will bridge the north-south divide. Is this credible? Manchester London, as I said, is already every 20 minutes in 2 hours 8 minutes. Will the northwest be transformed if the journey time comes down to 1.25 hours in 2032-3? I don't believe so. What's clear is that the areas around the high-speed stations will do very well at the expense of the rest of the region. So good for Manchester, directly served by HS2, but bad for Liverpool, which isn't. Where will people invest where the stations are? Or in Kent, now, good for Ashford, but Margate and Ramsgate remain desperately depressed. It's a very expensive zero-sum game. But surely every other major country's got one. Well, not every country. The United States, which still seems pretty prosperous to me, where President Obama's ambitions for high-speed rail are rapidly withering. And most countries that have built new lines use them for much longer distances. I have a son living in Tokyo, so I worry about Japan a lot at the moment, but it means I understand it. Tokyo to Osaka is 553 kilometres. London-Manchester is 296 kilometres. And most countries who built high-speed lines had slower services on the classic networks. The old route from Frankfurt to Cologne, the classic route from Frankfurt to Cologne, takes 140 minutes. It's the same distance as London-Birmingham, where the trains today take 84 minutes. At a national level, Spain has invested proportionally more than anyone else. It's certainly increased the country's debt, but it's less clear that it's helped to drive economic growth. Lastly, the financial case. Sadly, the rail industry has become a basket case. The last government set up the Rail Value for Money study, which I believe is going to report in May. Its September 2010 interim submission listed some pretty brutal home truths. Cost of operation have risen by 19% per train kilometre since 1996-7. Cost of the taxpayer, real terms, of the railway has risen from 2.3 billion in 1993-4 to 5.2 billion in 2008-9. Track utilisation is lower than in some comparable countries. Network Rail's regulated asset base will rise to 42 billion by 2014. Lucky we're not quite a small third world country, isn't it? A rational response from government would be to get the industry to sweat its assets and make better use of its trains and tracks, using smart IT to improve load factors and radio signalling and targeted investment to drive up network utilisation. But HS2 will just make the financial position worse. From government's own optimistic figures, it's a 30 billion upfront capital project which over 60 years will have a net cost to the taxpayer of 17 billion. In April 2010, the rating agency Fitch looked at high-speed rail projects, a couple of quotes, they're very dry and brutal, unemotional people. Historically, the agency has observed that the assessment of rail demand has displayed a significant optimism bias, particularly for greenfield projects. And rail projects are often high profile. This exposes them to political entrepreneur syndrome, a lovely phrase, where the public authorities overestimate the benefits of the project to get it approved for the purpose of political gain. HS2 is as bad as Concord. Thank you.
Chris, thank you very much. Now for the more positive case, over to Jim.
I'd like to just talk about the evidence. Both Chris and I pore over the documents that emanate from the department and HS2 Limited, and if it sounds like two old sort of geezers who ruminate over the Old Testament and interpretations of it, I do apologise, but I do disagree with, I'm afraid, an awful lot of what Chris has just said. There have been 10 years of studies of high-speed rail, north-south high-speed rail links in Britain. This isn't something that's just been dreamt up recently, even if it's only come to broad public attention pretty recently. Studies in 2002-3 for the Strategic Rail Authority. Greengage did a study in 2009, so did Network Rail, and then the department published their work just over a year ago, and they've just updated it. So all of those theologians like Chris and I who try and interpret the numbers are just trying to deal with the refreshed case. But the important thing is that all of those studies have shown there is a good case for high-speed rail, all of them. And in the middle of that decade that we've just been through, there was a very important and very influential report produced by Sir Rod Eddington, who is best known in this country as ex-head of British Airways. He was asked by the Treasury in the department to review our national transport policy, and everybody sort of looked at the report and said, well, that's kind of concluded that there's no case for high-speed rail in Britain. And they sort of happily went on and assumed nothing would happen. Of course, actually Sir Rod's view was that high-speed rail in this country is not only a good idea, we should be getting on building it. This only became clear when he was cross-examined by the Transport Select Committee 3 months after his report was published. But it is important because a lot of the transport economists in the world took great notice of what he said, but they rather tend to disregard what he actually concluded. His comments in the published report, by way of explanation, were that he didn't believe in maglev, which was the new technology on offer at the time. He was totally comfortable with conventional high-speed rail. My own experience is based on Greengage 21, which was launched 5 years ago. And just to save anybody still trying to get freedom of information requests out of the department, no, the department's never funded Greengage. It has been funded by a public interest group, which comprises a lot of other public bodies interested in the subject. but the department's never funded any of it, and so I'm really observing what they've done as well as you, despite having produced some evidence on the subject. But what I'd like to just talk about is this question that Julian posed, is it worth it? And that's about the business case. And if my friend Christian Woolmar were here, he'd immediately throw a sort of bit of a wob because he hates the phrase business case, and it is indeed a bit of a silly phrase. This is the cost-benefit case, as it used to be known, dressed in modern language. The current estimate, heavily downgraded since a year ago to take account of the recession, which wasn't taken into account in the March numbers, is that the cost-benefit ratio, the benefit-cost ratio, I should say, is 2 to 1. Every pound of money spent, and it is a significant sum, produces £2 worth of economic benefit. And on that basis, the Treasury, the Department of Transport will say, well, that's a good project. They might say there are other things to take into account, and there always are. There's already been a lot of debate on this subject. No doubt there's going to be some of the familiar arguments trotted out again. We've already heard one. Well, the demand forecast, everybody, I have to say, always says this if they're objecting to any transport project. The demand forecast is over-egged. Well, look at the documents. The underlying growth in demand assumed by the department is plus 1.4% per annum. Over the last 10 or 15 years, the growth in long-distance rail demand, not just in this corridor, which is a bit of a special case, has been plus 5% per annum. So this is over-egged. I don't think so. I would make the case that actually this is a very cautious forecast. Then people will say, if they're objecting, well, there's got to be a better or a cheaper alternative. And objectors may well think this is fruitful territory. I'm really not convinced that it is, and let me explain why. It's about capacity. The underlying reason that has united political leaders in successive governments is a concern about capacity. And many people say to me, if only you didn't call it high-speed rail, call it capacity solution or something. I can't think of a nice snazzy name. Life would be a lot easier. High Speed 2 provides for 14 trains an hour in each direction. Long trains built on purpose, piece of infrastructure. And it frees up a lot of capacity on the lines that the intercity trains, the non-stopping trains, will no longer need to run. So it gives a huge capacity uplift. Incidentally, the services at the places en route can get a much, much better service. People have said, oh, well, Coventry is going to get a very much worse service, or somewhere else is. No, all of the places on the West Coast main line, like Coventry, Tamworth, Rugby, Milton Keynes, all of these places can get a very, very much better service. Are those things in the business case for High Speed 2, even though they are enabled by it? No, they're not. It's a cautious business case. The best performing of the rail upgrade options, in fact the only one that's even got a positive benefit cost ratio, is called Rail Package 2. As far as I can see, it adds 3 trains an hour in the peak period on the West Coast main line. So you can see it's a much more modest impact on capacity. So what you have to ask is, let's assume that gives us some capacity for a few years, which clearly it would do. What happens after then? And there you would have to look at the other rail packages, which basically end up with, guess what, building new lines across the Chilterns, across Warwickshire and the rest of it. It's a cul-de-sac, it's a disruptive and not very good value for money alternative. Just on the regional economic effects briefly, the evidence we have is that there will be a lot of benefit across the regions. And the evidence from countries which have high-speed rail is that many cities have benefited from it. GDP per head in the UK declines remarkably nicely in statistical terms with rail journey time to London. There is a price you pay economically for being peripheral. And some people will say, okay, but you build high-speed rail, there's a two-way effect, and maybe the regional economies will get worse with high-speed rail. Well, you know, in truth, there is risk around this. But again, look at the evidence. Have businesses in the big provincial cities in France decline because they've got a high-speed rail connection to Paris? The answer is no, they haven't. But even if you think, well, I still feel nervous about that, just bear this in mind. There is no incorporation of possible rebalancing of the national economy in the business case at all. Nobody's ever assumed in any of these analyses that jobs will migrate from the southeast to the northwest of Scotland. People believe it might happen. The Prime Minister says this is part of why he's backing it. And it will depend on the way in which the economy responds, of course. But none of it is built into the business case. Just briefly on sustainability, I mean, I just take the opposite view to Chris, exactly the same numbers. If you can add capacity to the national transport system and have a neutral impact on carbon, even after you've allowed for the embedded carbon in the construction of something like HS2, I think that's a remarkably benign outcome. And it's also an outcome that you will not get from any other equivalent intervention. And it's an outcome that will improve over time, unless you believe we're going to be consuming and producing as much carbon out of our energy in the future as we are today. And unless you assume that having built HS2 will go no further and really make the difference in terms of Anglo-Scottish air demand. So I think ministers have done a pretty remarkable job in backing HS2 and overcoming what I've observed, and I'm sure Chris and others have observed over the years, which is an extraordinary reluctance to think beyond the short term. Let's just spend a moment, reflecting on our friends over in the Houses of Parliament. It's a tough call for politicians to back something that will come to fruition in 15 years' time and later. But they have done, and I think they're to be congratulated for it. Thank you.
Well, it's always a pleasure.
Great stuff. Oh, no. Take it away.
He was telling me we're in danger of running behind, and we don't like our trains to run behind, otherwise we have to give you a refund. I'm a great fan of high-speed rail, not because I've been converted and I'm about to leave Chris in the lurch, but in the right place. Between Tokyo and Osaka, a high-speed train leaves at peak time every 3 minutes with 1,300 seats. That's 2,600 seats leaving within 4 minutes. If you've got that sort of demand, high-speed rail is perfect. But let's take what I think are the ludicrous numbers that Jim likes. We discover that today between Manchester and central London, we have enough demand for 2 trains not every 4 minutes, but 2 trains a day. That's predicted to rise by 2031 to 5 trains worth of people a day. It's worth having a high-speed line if you've got that sort of density every 3 minutes. It's not worth having a high-speed line if it takes you all day to fill 5 trains. It makes no sense. And that's why Eddington did not persuade the authors of his report to come out in favour of high-speed rail. That's why his report has a lovely chart that shows the benefit-cost ratio by size of scheme. The smaller the scheme, the higher the average benefit-cost ratio. There are a whole host of schemes listed in Eddington with a benefit-cost ratio of 6 to 10 to 1. A benefit-cost ratio of 2 to 1 is very low by transport standards. So let's think about regeneration for a moment. We could make Manchester as close to London as Birmingham is now. So we could make Manchester as rich as Birmingham is now, which won't be very difficult actually because they're both as rich as each other. It won't change Manchester to be as close to London as Birmingham is. It's a complete myth. What makes places like Huddersfield poor is the fact that their talent leaves. And you can see that in this room today, because Neil left Huddersfield. Now, I'm not criticising Neil for leaving Huddersfield, but the reason why places are poor is about human capital. You should read Ed Glacer's recent book, Triumph of the City, if you want more details. Once you strip out the difference in human capital across the country, most of the north-south divide disappears, and what is left is almost all a difference in unemployment of people completely without skills.
And if we think high-speed rail is suddenly going to lead to young people who are not in employment or training and have no qualifications getting jobs in Huddersfield, then frankly you're living in cloud cuckoo land. We also know that it won't make much difference to most door-to-door journeys. So Julian, for example, lives in Mile End. He also lives in the Derbyshire Dales. It's all right for some. Now, if you take the total time from one of his front doors to another of his front doors, and you actually work out what improving the rail bit of that would make, it's not transforming a journey time in the same way as people who give you the percentage between stations. And that's really critical. We talk of Stoke and Coventry. Coventry currently has 3 fast trains an hour. There is not a bat's chance in hell that it will have that once those trains are not going to Birmingham, because almost all of the people on those trains are going to Birmingham. When I caught the non-stop train from Stoke to London, I was the only person to get on it at Stoke. Jim's quite right. He said if there's demand for these services, they'll continue. But on their own there isn't, so they won't. And then Stoke and Coventry will end up like Sunderland, stuck at the end of a branch line and very poor indeed. And indeed, the figures include a 3.1 billion saving in classic services from cutting back those services. There will be fewer services on traditional rail. So instead we should think about what we want transport for. And I want to set you all a task for the next week. Every time you go somewhere by any mode of transport, I want you to write down what it would have taken to persuade you to use another mode of transport. So when you use your car, think, what would have made me use a train, and vice versa. I came into London by train today. You'd have to pay me a fortune to drive into central London. But when I use my car for most of the journeys I use it for, you'd have to pay me a fortune to use the train instead. Indeed, even at weekends, I usually drive to see my mum in Portsmouth, even though I have 6 free tickets a year for use at the weekends on South West trains. It's still much more convenient to use the car, and even at 0 price, I won't change. And that's why when we build more rail, what we get are additional journeys, not modal shift, which is why the environmental case is so poor. Trains are very useful. They're useful for city centre to city centre business travel, which if you've got cities as large as Tokyo and Osaka, means you can fill your trains. If you've only got cities the size of Birmingham or Manchester and London, then you won't. Those of you who read the Sunday Telegraph will have seen Andrew Gilligan's piece yesterday on High Speed 1. There's a lovely picture of a completely empty High Speed 1 train between London and Ashford, where they've had to cut the trains in half, so low is the demand. Trains don't fill themselves, there has to be an underlying economic rationale. Now, the opportunity cost is 2 to 1, as Jim said, but that does assume, I don't know where you got your 1.4 or 5% or whatever figure for passenger growth, but according to the figures on the Department for Transport website, the projected growth between Manchester and central London between 2021 and 2031 is a staggering 17% a year. If you don't believe it, I can give you the numbers, you can do it in your head if you're very good at maths, on a calculator. It's never going to happen. We're not going to get 17% a year growth. We're going to have everybody in Manchester dashing up and down to come to London, and wonderful that our city is. That isn't the reality. And those numbers are very similar for Leeds and Birmingham, etc. So even when you claim 17% growth, you only get a benefit cost ratio of 2 to 1. Whereas for 243 million, we can put in the flyover at Milton Keynes that will increase capacity. But what I thought was really honest was when Julian said, if we don't build this, we won't use the money for other rail schemes. And I think that's right. And I think we should remember it. What would the government do with that money? Maybe it would spend it on a pupil premium. Maybe it would spend it on better healthcare. There are many, many other priorities that ought to be considered. And I, for one, would much rather see that money spent on giving our kids the best future that they can have, rather than building a railway line that will be used by a handful of generally very rich people to get slightly faster to or from the provinces. Thank you.
Very good, great stuff, Tim. So we now have a bit of time for some questions and answers. I'm sure we have a very distinguished audience. I know from looking at the list this evening here, you all have lots of questions. If you could put up your hands and also say who you are and where you're from, that would be very, very helpful indeed. Is there anyone who wants to kick off? Nobody.
You're blind.
Nobody. Oh, there is. There's a lady at the very back. I think there's a roving mic that will come to you.
Thank you. I'm Julie Hilling and I'm the MP for Bolton West and a member of the Transport Select Committee and somebody that's very much in favour of High Speed 2 and somebody who's a North West MP. One thing that strikes me with all of this, that the anti-people haven't presented an alternative to any of the problems, apart from a flyover at Milton Keynes. So we have an issue at the moment that the assets are already sweating, and people, Network Rail are talking about there being no capacity after 2015, no additional capacity, I think it's 2015. What happens with rates, with freight on the rail, and you also talk about an artificial peak. Well, I have to tell you, I actually travelled to Wigan rather than Manchester, but in the so-called peak, the trains are just as damn full and it's really hard to find a seat as it is in the sort of off-peak period, although I must admit on the off-peak period you are playing sardines. So I just think that I haven't heard an alternative to what happens when we reach capacity. And maybe the answer is, well, we build a freight line, we build a slow line, but why would we be building for the 20th century rather than for the future? So I need to hear what are you going to do about capacity?
Okay, that sounds like mostly a question for the nurse. Who wants to?
Yeah, I obviously failed to communicate because I think I offered some alternatives. Firstly, there is a major artificial peak. If you look at the Network Rail draft route utilisation strategy, it says there 6 trains with standing passengers on Friday nights. At present, those are all trains immediately after 1900.
But we're standing at 5 o'clock as well, is what I'm saying to you.
Okay. Secondly, there is a current scheme to lengthen most of the trains, but bizarrely not all of them, from 9 to 11 cars because of the detailed configuration of the cars. This actually increases standard class seating by 51%, which is a pretty big increase. Thirdly, they can be increased further to 12 cars, except as I explained to Liverpool. Fourthly, I don't think anyone would notice, frankly, if one of the 4 first-class coaches was turned into a standard class coach. Corporates are cut back enormously on business expense travel. The public sector has as well. The load factor is very low in first class. Then there's smarter IT to produce better loadings. Why should we tolerate, as taxpayers in a very heavily subsidised industry, subsidising a railway with 50% load factors? We don't subsidise airlines with 50% load factors. As I said, they would go out of business.
So, just to be clear, so your answer really to the question about what happens when we hit capacity is, if we do all these things, we won't hit the capacity constraint.
But we could cope with we could actually cope with the background growth that DfT have forecast in their business case, which is 100%. They then add all sorts of stuff for the attractions of High Speed 2, so they said High Speed 2 would grow by 200%, and then you have to believe, as Tim has said, that this is so attractive that you're going to get 3 times as many people from Wigan or Manchester to London as there are now. It isn't happening between London and Paris. It isn't actually happening in Japan. The market between Tokyo and Osaka is saturated. There's not endless growth.
Right.
So just come in briefly on that. I think one of the things that we see from the No campaign is not just an argument against high-speed rail, but a quite rapid questioning of the economics of railways altogether. One of the things that I think both of them should explain is whether they do believe in the state enhancing and spending money on subsidising or improving railways on long-distance travel. I know Tim, and we can trade where we live. I think Tim's devoted very much to the course of Silverton railway station and the improvements and transport thereof. And no doubt that needs to be done. But it isn't. Many of the arguments that are deployed against high speed 2 are arguments against long-distance railways altogether. Now that's a much more profound question. I think we need to be honest about whether they want it or not.
I'll give you a 1 sentence after that, which is I'm in favour of low-cost, unsubsidised railways. Because once you're adding 50% capacity for the cost of 2 extra carriages, the business case in a commercial sense for railways begins to stack up very, very quickly. The railway at the moment is divided into a handful of lines, including the line from here to Wigan, that are profitable on any sensible understanding of that word, including London to Surbiton, which is gobsmackingly profitable, and then a whole bunch of lines that are used by 2 men and a dog once a year, and which, to be honest, and as you say, it's a different debate, I am completely indifferent to. But your line is profitable, more carriages, more seats, lower taxes, yep, more spending on schools. We are talking 4 billion expenditure by Greater Manchester on high-speed rail. I'd rather give that 4 billion to Greater Manchester to spend on schools, or if you really want to spend it on high-speed rail. But I think skills would give you a bigger return.
There's a gentleman in the second row that will go to.
My name is Ray Smith. I'm from the Campaign to Protect Rural England CPRE. Now, I know the panel is very much divided, but I'd like to seek agreement on one issue. That is, the business case is completely flawed. And not just the business case, but the whole way the business cases are appraised. Now, if you don't believe me, I'll quote from the not so exciting sounding Foster review of the Intercity Express programme. This was the plan to get rid of the old 125 trains on lots of lines. And this was published last year. Mr. Foster described the business case benefit cost ratio as a deceptively simple looking ratio, and noted they were sensitive to variations in the data, assumptions and valuations on what they're based. And also they change over time as the context, including policy context, changes. Now, for example, Heathrow, the third runway, something I was involved in a legal challenge against. The case in favour of that collapsed when the carbon value was doubled overnight. The case for high-speed rail has dropped by a third since last year, but in fact it's a classic case of rewrite, rubbish in, rubbish out, because the Department of Transport, in its ultimate wisdom, is telling us that a litre of petrol will cost £1.25 in 2030, and that's in last year's prices. So does the panel agree we need to move away from this fictional forecasting of the future and actually work out what policies we might have in 2030 or 2040, and then work out what the best transport options are for those policies?
Okay, good, interesting question about the whole way that we calculate the benefits of these things. So who wants to have a first?
Well, if I may, I mean, you're not alone, Rafe, in espousing this view. And people who earn their living by crunching through these analyses are always trying to look at ways of improving. But I don't find transport economists able to answer this question positively. Is there a better way than the current way to put together an assessment of a scheme that's basically about increasing transport capacity? You can have all kinds of bells and whistles, reliability, safety, environment. All these things get harder to evaluate, but the core of this is what's the value of increasing transport capacity? Now, the way this has been done in this country and around the world for 50 years, the Victoria Line, the M1, these schemes have all been analysed basically the same way. And it is an analytical tool based on, Tim will know more about the history of this than I do, but it's based on a whole strand of microeconomic theory, welfare economics developed through the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, until people had computers, they couldn't really do the sums. And I realise it seems to many people potty, why are you adding up time savings? You're adding them up to try to get a balanced, objective view of what the impact of a change to the transport system is, in terms of, is it worth it to the economy? That's what it does. So I, for one, others may disagree, don't think, no, I'm not going to buy your argument, it's all flawed.
I think it's flawed in the sense that, you have to have some methodology to do it, so there's some common ground between myself and Jim. I think it's flawed in the sense that this is a point estimate. This is lunacy. We should be looking at different scenarios, at possible different views of the world. We should be having an adult debate, instead of which we have ministers hammering their nails into the wall of a point estimate, which actually I think is also itself flawed deeply.
You're certainly right that for politicians they're not persuaded by the business case, they're persuaded by the feeling that the future involves high-speed line, rapid transport, high capacity. It's a decision they've made, the numbers come in and support the case, and we can debate whether the numbers are right or wrong. But it is a political decision about the feeling of the future. And so when David Cameron, when Angela Jones, when Gordon Brown was the ones persuaded about the thing, when they stand up and say it, it's because they have a feeling of the kind of country they want to create. And that is the fundamental point of politics. You are not standing there to kind of spout numbers fed into you by Tim Loynick. You're standing there to describe the kind of country you want against people like Tim Loynick, who will always be there to stop you doing things. Sometimes the people who are telling you the numbers are right, sometimes they're not. It is never certain. But I think many of the things through history that we have built in our country we use now, we rely on a part of our economy, I think that at the time we did them, there were always people saying, this is the case that's strong for them. The M1 wasn't built because somebody did a business case. The M1 was built because it was clear we needed a motorway from the north to the south. And I feel the same about high-speed rail.
Yeah, I think we're in agreement here. We all believe, I don't think any of us actually object to the methodologies used by the Department for Transport. So actually I think we all reject your case. But you've got your unanimity against you instead of agreeing. But none of us think that these studies should be then mechanistically applied. They're always a politician's judgment, and sometimes you get someone like Andrew Adonis who just likes playing with trains, and sometimes you get someone who just likes playing with cars. You get a complete petrol head, and that's what democracy is all about. We get to vote for our politicians, and that's critical. We don't live in some Soviet Gosplan world. I don't think any of us really object to the methodologies that the government is using, either to assess the cost-benefit analysis, or then to enact, or then to make the decision as to whether we should do it. It's a combination of expertise and democracy, and none of us, I think, are criticising that.
It's a good question. Alex, and there's a gentleman next to him.
While both sides were speaking, I found myself, I'm Alex and I work for Policy Exchange as well, on housing and planning. While both sides were speaking, I found myself in agreement with them, because both of them were saying, well, the evidence is clearly on my side, and obviously without having time to go away and read all the evidence, you don't quite know who you're believing, so you believe one side and then you believe the other. Do you think a way around this would be to move to some kind of per passenger mile travel subsidy? So instead of having this kind of debate where most people in this room, no matter how informed in this area, don't really know which of you is making the best case or not, if you had some kind of per passenger mile subsidy, that transport would go along those lines. So then you would have people saying, well, the cost benefit says this and the cost benefit says that, because the government would say, we will subsidise passenger miles by X, and then business would provide that and get the subsidy or not, and you'd end up removing this kind of politicised debate that we're having now.
It's a lovely idea, and you could write a paper on it. It's a completely nutty idea, ultimately, because ultimately building high-speed rail is a decision for government because of the issues of compulsory purchase, buying out land, etc. So no, I don't think
Can you pass that to private companies?
Because a private company cannot build a high-speed line from here to the North of England. There are just too many bits of land for which it has to use compulsory purchase. You have to have a democratic decision to do it or not.
Yeah, that seems like a fairly clear answer. There's a gentleman just to Alex's right.
I'm no gentleman, but I'm Professor James Woodhousen and bigpotatoes.org. I don't think the high-speed 2 proposal goes far enough or fast enough. And I put it to you that, nor do the big potatoes people actually, to declare to commence to start to get ready to draw up a plan for something maybe in 2032, at the cost of 10 demolitions, if you're really right about that, Julian, seems to me to connote the lack of ambition that is the cultural moment in the West generally, and especially in Britain. So I think, Julian, you were quite right to say that cost-benefit analysis and the numbers game doesn't do it. It's not even the North-South divide that does it for me. It's the fact that we would be undertaking something ambitious that is firmly pro-growth, firmly pro-engineering and technology, and that it would change the mindset of Londoners, Liverpudlians, and all of that, just as Eurostar has done that to some extent in Anglo-French relations. You all agree that the line should be subordinate to the criterion of low carbon. I can't go along with that, and I'm no skeptic either. I think the criterion isn't just the transport benefits, or even those Marshallian externalities that I think are the root, even before what you were saying about welfare economics in the 20s, goes back to the most boring economist ever, and the inspiration for the Greens, and goes back to Bentham, actually, finally, even more boring. But what I would like to see is some sense of, not especially state, but general grand projet, which inspire, which go further than a 9 billion party for a month with the Olympics, and don't just talk about the legacy and all of that, but really dynamize this country out of the drift happens, not shift happens, but drift happens, lethargy of the West.
You're reinventing Concorde, I take it.
Yes, I am, and I like it even
Did
faster.
Concorde produce the dynamic effect that you're talking to? I think not.
No, but I'm not talking about the economic effects. I'm talking about the sense of human achievement, which is so lost in secondary schools and in political culture today. where a blowout of a tire in Concord is enough for you to write off high-speed train, where a small release of radiation, a Fukushima release of radiation allows you to make some cheap jokes about how nobody's going to talk about nuclear power as a low-carbon source anymore. That's really outrageous. You should be upholding technology.
I'd rather invest in the schools in Bolton.
Let me just come in very quickly. I think people have to build lines that are useful and planned to work and are democratically acceptable. I think we don't bulldoze people's houses. But the Concorde thing is different. Concorde was inventing a new piece of technology. This is like saying let's build a motorway. We know how to do it. There are perfectly good trains.
That's why I didn't
which we can
know.
look at. So it is not fair to constantly say this is like Concorde. Concorde, that would be
No,
a very
you're
good
saying yours is
train.
like Concorde, but his is
Yes.
like Concorde.
Yes.
He's claiming that you're not like Concorde enough. So I think which means your ingredient disagreeing with him again.
So people have the sense that this is actually about something bigger. This is about our ability as a nation to do big things, to act strategically, to build something, that kind of thing.
Yeah, we can act strategically. We could act strategically to improve our schools so that so many of our children do not leave at 16 without any hope in hell of ever getting more benefits. That's the sort of strategic choice I would like to see our government make. I wish the previous government had made it, or the one before that. At any point in British history, a government has actually got serious about education.
There is not an entire contradiction between building high-speed line on British schools. Nobody advocating high-speed rail is saying let's shut down 14% of schools to fund it.
But as you said, the money would be used for something else if it wasn't used for high speed.
Well, it might not be raised at all. It's possibly will be paid for the general taxation.
Yeah, I think that just the one thing I would say is that, the thing that probably helped politicians get behind this was the completion of Channel Tunnel Rail, which of course nowadays people just say, oh, but the demand forecast was wrong. But actually, even, I was listening to Frank Dobson the other day, who was quite worried about HS2 and his constituency around Euston. But as he said, but of course nobody now would want to get rid of the Channel Tunnel Railway. I mean, it has been a huge success, and it combined actually, baked big potatoes, it combined that wonderful British love of nostalgia, i.e. St Pancras is a wonderful place, with being modern. So, it did you big potatoes in an acceptable way for we rather, cautious Brits. Yeah. And that's why there is, in part, why there's political backing for HS2. There is a sense that actually we can do these things. We don't just have to believe that the rest of the world.
Three questions was from this gentleman here.
Dan Captain, Airport Operators Association. Thank you for a very interesting debate. Given that most people accept that you won't have massive displacement between rail and domestic air travel, given that the air industry and the airport sector back HSR2 in May, do you think that the government's made a strategic error by backing trains over aviation, or high-speed rail over aviation? And really, if it's serious about connectivity and about growth, about supporting UK PLC, it would support any infrastructure that can help UK PLC grow and create jobs.
A quick reaction. I think the airports, the airlines and the airport operators back in because for them it's a free lunch.
I certainly think the government strategy on aviation is confused. Mildly, I would broadly support Heathrow. I think what the Royal Aviation Law is not defined inside Britain, but defined long distance. London particularly has to consider the decline of long distance connections. That is not the same as the case for
More unanimity on the platform.
It's kind of going around. Just at the end of that row, and then to the front.
Alex Jan from Arrow, so I have to be careful what I say. And I was also actually taught at the LSE, so I have to be doubly careful what I say. With two sort of observations, questions. One is about sort of this issue of trust, public trust in decision making in politics, which we all know has suffered tremendously over the last 4 or 5 years for lots of reasons that we're aware of, these dismissals and so forth. I think if we're going to have a debate about something like high speed 2, should it not really be more honest? So what I'm trying to say is, if it is about the strategic project, the visionary stuff, the transformative nature of the project, then that's fine and people can make their minds up on that. If the cost benefit is stonkingly good, then obviously we can have a debate about that. Is there not a risk though that people perceive that they're getting mixed messages around the scheme because on the one hand it's been justified with one, on the other with the other, and you know the fact is there are other schemes out there which do produce in numerical terms better cost benefit analysis. So should we not be hearing about the fundamental case being about the transformative nature and the political aspect of the project rather than, you know, a bias maybe towards the cost benefit? Anyway, I told you I should have answered. The second thing I was going to ask very quickly is the road pricing aspect of this, and you know the extent to which surely we would see a more coherent transport infrastructure provision in the UK if actually we had proper pricing. And I guess, Tim, I take a little bit of exception to the line which is the private sector couldn't come forward with these sorts of projects. I take your point about land acquisition and the rest of it. But if only we had fairer pricing of the road, I think you'd see the private sector actually coming up with more ideas as to how to, you know, profitable ideas maybe as to how to meet demand. Welcome the balanced views.
So, two good questions there about the way this has been sold by politicians and also about a question about road pricing. On the point about how this has been sold, do you want to?
I don't think it's been sold very well, so I think politicians didn't know much about transport. They decided it was exciting. They finished the kind of thing they wanted for the country.
Speak up, please.
Sorry, I don't think it has been sold particularly well so far. I think that there has been a decision to have it, which I think is the correct decision. And I think there's been a very sensible process of trying to design it and trying to achieve some sort of political utility inside politics and not to have competing issues of route or destination, which would have ripped apart the plan. So Andrew Donis's great success was to persuade the Tory party that it was a good thing, and in the end the Tory party came round to that. And that's why I think it will happen. I think the public, it's very hard to say to the public anything other than this is a good thing, it will happen, it will be quite expensive, and it will take a long time. Unless you live on the route, it's quite a distant thing until it's built. That's true of all sorts of infrastructure. The public don't have profound views on any kind of infrastructure except things that affect them directly. They do use infrastructure, they need it to be really benefiting. And that's why the politicians make the decisions.
Are you all pro road pricing? Anti-road pricing?
I think road pricing is much overstated because road car transport is already very heavily taxed compared with most measures of its externalities. So if we had road pricing on motorways, I don't think demand would go down much. That's the evidence in London, where the congestion charge of £10 equates to something like £1.50 a mile, and yet demand has only gone down 17%, I think it is. So I think road pricing would have a very, very limited effect, unless it was so expensive that it would be politically unfeasible and economically unjustified and environmentally unjustified. So I'm in favour of it, but just like I'm in favour of water metering, the evidence is it reduces water consumption by a very small amount. I should say, by the way, that in terms of the case, that is the case. That's what I printed off today. And that was just document 1. There are another sort of 15 of these. So at some level, politicians are always going to have to simplify things. And they'll simplify things in the way that gets them on the front page of the newspaper. That's the reality. We have to accept it. That's what politicians are for.
Jerome Miller from URS. I think the thing that fascinates me is the issue of increasing capacity through a high-speed line to separate that slow and fast services. And as a result of that, not only increasing the journey time for some, but for all, but also the increase in reliability. And that then leads into the rest of the network and how that works as a complete transport system, whether you travel by car to park and ride or other train services, seems to be absolutely critical in improving the overall reliability of long distance journey by rail. And I think that's not really been drawn out any light enough in what we've seen or heard today.
Okay. So is this point about the reliability in the case, or is it this?
Yes, it is in the case, and it has been discussed. And you know, I mean, is this something that a lot of people have been studying now for several years? And I hear the sort of, oh, well, it's not been sold very well. You know, if this meeting was in Manchester or Birmingham or Liverpool or Leeds or Sheffield or Edinburgh or Glasgow, actually, at one level, they may not be quite as pretty as you lot, but they would be pretty well informed because they've been on this case now for 2 or 3 years. So you'll find the core cities group, which is the 8 big English cities and their chambers of commerce, and Edinburgh, Glasgow, and their chambers of commerce, and Cardiff, even places that are clearly not going to benefit from HS2, but do believe in a truly national high-speed rail network serving the whole of Britain, end quote from coalition agreement, is what they want. And so do all of the 8 shortly to be demised regional development agencies. And so incidentally, just to confuse you, does the City of London Corporation. And so too does the Mayor for London, because he's built in high-speed rail in his revision to the London plan. So the people who've been thinking about, well, how do I make cities grow? I mean, you may choose to say, well, this won't happen. Or how do I get more jobs, and particularly in the regions? They think this is going to help. And they're very worried about the prospect now that it might be, as Julian said, it might be taken away, because they think this is at the last minute. Another bunch of people who are opposed to it think, well, we've only just heard of it. We're only just beginning to understand the details. They can't even tell us, you know, where the alignment's going to go really exactly. So there is a problem, and hopefully we'll go through it in a sort of in a mature way, as Chris said, and debate it in a sensible timescale. It is actually being produced pretty quick, I would say. Not just by our standards, but even by French standards. Don't believe that the French, you know, just get on, go back, will do it. They do actually take time. I personally think it's right that people have a chance to debate, discuss, and there are so many. I mean, your question really was about, well, you know, these different arguments, capacity, or is it about more? It's about all of these things. You take it back.
No, to be honest with you, it's the extent to which people use cost benefits to backfill decisions that have already been made, and the effect that
You have
has.
to deal with Treasury. Treasury will go nuts. You have to follow a Green Book guideline, and many people will say they should go nuts, unless you follow this and can demonstrate that you've thought about it.
Is that the same Treasury that led us so successfully through the credit crunch?
Yeah.
There's a question right to the front here. There's a lady on the left-hand side.
Can you speak up?
Yeah. Just a moment. Chat.
My point is general, less about specifically and more about because we've heard from the panel that everybody knows that that's a simple analysis as well. Right. But one of the problems, even when you follow the big agreement, it's very clear you should factor in all the costs of service and what they don't. And actually, when you look at something like runway 3, one of the reasons it fell down is because they hadn't put any cost on surface congestion in the west of London. Actually, you can do that. It's not that hard. You can come up with proxies and you can do that. And when you factor in all the costs and all the benefits, it can really change things. And I think we have such a predominant thought around the economy, and actually what we should be talking about is value to society. Now that means you've got to take account of the environmental and the social as well as the economic. Now it's much easier to value the economic because we have prices in the market. Actually, there are ways of approximating environmental effects and social effects that are really important and can actually change the benefit-cost ratio. And I think it's a bit, just going back to your honesty point and how you bring the public on side. I mean, let's face it, it's a political decision, we all know that. But the appraisal is an important part of it because it does tell you some things. But it can only tell you to the best of its ability if you really value all those things that can be valued. And a lot of things can be valued, but they still get left out. So I think, yes, cost-benefit analysis, but let's be honest about what you can value, because it's more than you often see.
I think we all agree with you on that. The environmental stuff is certainly in there. The social stuff is much harder to do, because whilst we can all...
They haven't valued the natural environment, I don't think, when I just do. And you can do it.
But it's in the statement.
It's £12.49 for Chiltern's Hills, according to a report by the DMT that was buried because I was so embarrassed by it.
Sorry,
£12.43 per household, that's what they value.
Per household over which area?
This is a fictional line in the Hemel Hempstead area.
Yes. But certainly DFT do have a methodology for trying to include visual amenity. And we did in the case of the, you might not be high enough, but it is there, and we can certainly argue about the figures, but those things are there, but social ones are much higher, because it's really hard to work out what it means for social inclusion, for example, not least because a railway line can be very hard to cross, and it can split communities, but it can also join them. But DFT is certainly, they're at the forefront internationally with their wider economic benefit, transport, appraisal, guidance.
So why didn't
we have all...
surface congestion costs in the case of 1 and 3?
Oh, I have no, well, that's obviously an error. That's obviously an error.
All I'm saying is flag up concern.
We all agree with you that there are errors in this and that we constantly need to strive to make them better. But Britain is one of the global leaders in doing wider economic benefits. Dan Graham at Imperial really is at the global forefront of this part of economics.
Can I come in, because you mentioned a very interesting analogy with Heathrow runway 3. There is a massive issue which hasn't really surfaced yet, and I'm not taking a value on it either way, in relation to dispersal from Euston. It is already the case that the Victoria line is completely stuck. Exactly, you can wait there in the morning peak for 3 or 4 trains before you can get onto it. High Speed 2, the full scheme, actually concentrates intercity travel from 3 existing London terminals, all at Euston. I think if you ask TfL, and I guess they will say this in their consultation response, they will say that in order to deal with the number of people going through Euston, both because of the projected growth and because of the concentration, it will be necessary to build Crossrail 2. And logically, it will be necessary to build Crossrail 2 so that it opens at the same time as the full second stage of HS2, i.e. 2032-33. That's not to say I think Crossrail 2 is a good thing or a bad thing. It is to say that the bill suddenly becomes 45 billion, not 30 billion, and that it's complicated, as Heathrow was, but it may be the right thing to do to build Crossrail 2. It's a big issue.
No, on your high speed will connect with Crossrail 1 as well. Not everybody will have to get off at Euston.
I understand that, but TfL have done the numbers, and the numbers through Euston are going to increase vastly. Crossrail 1 won't do it, because Crossrail 1 only goes on one direction. This isn't me, this is TfL.
We are just about to run out of time. I don't know if we have time for one last question from anybody. No?
Yes.
Oh, there is. There's a
Hang on. Only with a microphone.
Can I just take it on a step, irrespective of whether you want it or not? I would like to ask, because you're also wise, your wisdom on whether or not the government can pull it off on its planning regime. Because I firmly believe that we have all the skills in the private sector to deliver a bloody good project on time with all those skills. I really believe we can do it environmentally well. I really think we can make this work. Can the government make this work? What confidence do you have? Not just that they will see it through, but they will pull off their planning reform.
Just very clear, if it goes into the House of Commons and House of Lords and all 3 parties support it, it will be a hybrid bill which will allow to bill. If Labour goes wobbly, having told us at the last election it's a wonderful thing, then it will be very hard for this government to start passing a hybrid bill.
Even in your best scenario timescale, because of...
Well, published timescale. It's a published timescale. It's completely possible if political support.
I think the published timescale is probably doubtful, because I would guess they're going to be Heathrow-type legal challenges on the way. Therefore, the hybrid bill probably, I would guess, doesn't come in this Parliament. And again, back to Julian's point, it will entirely depend on whether there is a political consensus. So it very much depends, I guess, on where Labour come out in the review.
And on that, the Labour shadow transport spokesman seems to be against the Labour is for. So we can
but a slightly different point, if I may, just linking with what Helen was saying, where I think our planning system is not good enough and our politicians are not brave enough, is to talk about the things that surround us as well. I mean, Chris may or may not be right, I disagree with him, but let's not get into it, about Euston Station. But there is an issue there, and you have to know what you're going to do there. You do have, in my mind, to say, what are you going to do for the people between London and Birmingham, and how are you going to get some kind of equivalent commitment to the improved services? Now, you can do these things through parliamentary bills, But you have to have it in your mind that that's the right and proper thing to do. It's not just a narrow infrastructure project that should be protected and kept remote from everything else. It is an infrastructure project, but it has a very broad impact, and we should find a way to incorporate beneficial outcomes across the piece. That is where, personally, I think our planning system needs further attention.
I'm afraid we are now exactly out of time. So Chris, Jim, Julian and Tim, you've been a brilliant panel. You as an audience have asked brilliant questions as well. I had hoped to come away with this with a very clear sense of what the right answer was. If anything, things are even less clear than they were for me. But never mind that, but you've been an excellent panel. It only really remains to thank you in the conventional way. Thank you so much.